Welcome back to the Inside the Industry Podcast Season 4, Episode 7, your ultimate guide to the inner workings of the pharmaceutical industry. Get ready for exclusive interviews, insider tips, and expert analyses from leading minds shaping the industry. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, comment below, and turn on post notifications to keep up with our content. Thank you again for your continued support, and let's begin with this episode.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Insight into Industry. My name is Talia, and I am alongside my classmate, Rovi, and we are both second-year pharmacy students at the UNC Eshelman School of Pharmacy. And today we're joined by Dr. Audrey Demaree. Dr. Demaree graduated from UNC Eshelman School of Pharmacy, and she is currently Director of Global Content and Education at Pfizer. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Demaree.
Yeah, nice for you to have me. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
All right, so just to get the ball rolling, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey into the industry from pharmacy school?
Yeah, so like I said, my name's Audrey. I grew up in Florida, so I'm I'm an East Coaster, but I currently reside in Seattle, Washington, which is, as far away as possible from Florida. Not on purpose, but the way that I really got into industry was a little bit by accident. I was working as an intern over the summer at a PR or marketing agency in New York City after my first year of pharmacy school. So I really just wanted to live in New York City for the summer. So I found an internship that was related to pharmacy in some way, and that this PR agency did pharmaceutical public relations for Lantus insulin. So I worked on the PR team for a summer, and really that was my first foray into industry. And while I was there, I got to work with a number of people on the pharmaceutical side of the business. So I worked with a lot of marketing managers and directors. And that was really how I kind of found out about this whole side of pharmaceuticals that was really new and interesting to me. So after that first year, I was really kind of set on going into industry. And I went the next summer to an internship at Pfizer. So again, kind of trying to get that next step up. I looked for internships. I applied to a bunch of different internships and ended up at Pfizer in their medical affairs department. So that was after my second year of pharmacy school. And I had such a good time during that internship that they actually asked me to come back after my third year of pharmacy school as an intern again. And so I was still in the medical affairs team. And during that time, I actually created my own fourth year rotation at Pfizer so that I could stay there for an even longer amount of time. So I turned my internship into a fourth year rotation so that I could stay for an extra month. And then also what was interesting during that time is my boss asked, do you have any interest in doing a fellowship here? And I was like, yes, but it doesn't exist. And he was like, well, we can fix that. And so I actually was able to work with Rutgers University to put a fellowship program in place at Pfizer in their kind of their primary care department at that time, because there were no fellows. And so it was a great way for me to kind of, in a way, create a job for myself. So I would encourage, people to ask the tough questions, put yourself out there. I just asked for this internship. I asked to do a fourth year rotation. I asked hey, I want to stay here. Is there a way we can make this work from a fellowship perspective? And so I think, you got to ask and put yourself out there because, maybe the answer is no, but maybe the answer is yes. And you've just created a job for yourself. So I had a really interesting path into industry. And I think it's it's something that I keep in the back of my mind is you have to create opportunities for yourself sometimes. And so I'd encourage people to kind of speak up and ask for what they want.
Yeah, that's amazing you're able to do that. And I feel like the fourth year rotations, it's surprising that you have so much space to do that, but not enough, like not many people do that or realize that. So I think that's definitely a nice perspective for students to realize.
Yeah, and the team at UNC was really great about helping me set it up. And I'm not sure if they still have the program there, but it was really easy, and they were able to do that for several years after I was there with my manager. So it also helped students after me, which I thought was great. So I'd encourage anybody, if they've got connections, to work with the school to create a rotation. It's a great experience.
Yeah, that's awesome. I guess I was kind of also curious about what activities and organizations were you involved with in pharmacy school? And do you feel like any of them particularly helped you kind of down the road equip you with the skill sets needed for these roles that you later pursued?
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest one I was involved with was APHA, and I was actually our regional delegate for APHA. So essentially there was 8 of us around the country, and we were involved in policy decisions. And so We would go to the annual APHA meeting, sit in on a lot of the policy discussions. We also got to meet all the other regional delegates in DC one summer, and did like a week-long activity where we'd go talk to lawmakers and talk about pharmacy policy. And so that was one way that I was really able to kind of get my foot in the door of understanding what's outside of the typical, pharmacy pathway. So not going and working in a community pharmacy or going into an academic setting. I really wanted to look at things outside of that. And so that's really one way that I kind of spread my wings a little bit, was looking at pharmaceutical policy through APHA. So I was really involved in that group, as well as CAPS and Kappa Epsilon as well. So I think just from my perspective, having those leadership roles and being involved in all those student organizations really taught me a lot about, the soft skills that are important for business, and presenting yourself in a business setting. So I think it's really important not only to be well-rounded from an academic perspective, but also from an extracurricular perspective, because those are the skills that really got me where I am today. I'm in charge of the training of our entire medical organization for specific assets at Pfizer. And so I wouldn't be able to do that if I didn't have the speaking skills and the leadership skills that I've learned along the way from all of those extracurriculars. So I think it was incredibly important. And I'm really happy that I was able to have those experiences at UNC.
Yeah, those are really awesome, unique experiences. So that's really awesome. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I believe UNC definitely does a great job at preparing us, even though in my personal belief, it is a very clinically oriented school. You can take advantage of those opportunities, such as, speaking, putting yourself in uncomfortable situations to kind of improve those skills that you can use, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of going back to that, I kind of want to hone in on that relationship you've had with Pfizer.
Mm-hmm.
One, it's really difficult that, as years are going on, the industry is getting more and more competitive and more
Mm-hmm.
saturated. And for students like myself and Talia, when we look to get ourselves involved with internships, what do
Mm-hmm.
you look for when you network? How do you network? What are ways
Yeah.
that you find to be the most effective?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think the biggest step that I took was going from that first internship as a PR intern, to working as a Pfizer intern. It's a really big step to go from kind of the agency side of things into the pharmaceutical side of things. And so that transition is quite difficult when you're out of school. So if you start working at an agency, it's kind of hard to get into the door at a pharmaceutical company. So I'm glad that I was able to do it as an intern. So I really think I got lucky with that. And from there, I was able to network with a lot of people at Pfizer that were past fellows. They kind of walked me through the process of like, how do you go about, preparing for all of these fellowship interviews? What are the things that the interviewees are looking for? And so in getting that initial internship and building those relationships, I think that's really how I learned how to play the game. And it's a game. I mean, you see how many people apply to these fellowships. It's crazy. And I think at mid-year one year, I had 110 interviews in a couple of days for, one or two fellowship positions that we were trying to fill. So it's quite difficult. And I think you have to really put yourself out there and try to get as many experiences as you can. Try to get published. I think it's also really important to understand who you're interviewing with and what products they're covering, because you can do a lot of research to figure out what's happening in that space to prepare you. So one of the things I always tell fellows that are trying to interview is that they really need to understand the product that they're interviewing for. So typically in the pharmaceutical space, you work on a couple products, right? I don't work on all of Pfizer's drugs. I work on 5 of them. So those are really the ones that I know and understand. And so it's really important to understand the products that the person you're interviewing with is covering, because then you can go on the website of the pharmaceutical company and say, hey, I'm going to read all the press releases about these couple drugs, and I'll bring that up during my interview. Say, hey, at ASCO, I saw you had this interesting new data on this particular drug. How were you involved with that? So it's really kind of getting to that next level in terms of what questions to ask, instead of just saying, what new data has Pfizer come out with? You say, hey, I read this press release about this interesting new data set. How are you involved with that? Because you have an idea about what that person's background is. So it's a little bit tricky, but if you take that extra time to like figure out what this person actually does at this company, and then can ask more specific questions, it really sets you apart from the pack. And so that's one of the things I really tried to do when I was going through the interview process. But again, like you mentioned, it all starts with networking and figuring out how to play the game a little bit.
No, definitely. Yeah, that's one thing I've tried to figure out as, this next school year starting is I want to get ahead and looking at these internships, but it's difficult. I don't know where to start. And I'm sure a lot of other students are kind of in the same boat, but I truly believe networking is a big portion to, navigating your career path.
Yep.
Do you have, I guess I have like a first question. What kind of places do you go aside from networking? What kind of resources, websites, or subscriptions were helpful in kind of keeping you up to date with those different like biotech updates or about those?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm lucky because I work at a company right now and they pay people to put
Yeah.
together these nice summaries of what's happening. But honestly, what I did was I as a starting point, I Googled like, what are the top 20 pharma companies? What are the top 50 pharma companies? And then I'd go to every single one of their websites and look for internships. I would look at Indeed and set up job alerts because a lot of the pharma companies do their internships at different times of the year in terms of when they hire them. And so generally it's in the springtime, but you never know when. So honestly, I went through and had a lot of time on the internet trying to figure out like when do pharma companies post their internships and things like that. But you can set up like, job alerts on Indeed or Google. And those are ways I kind of kept up to date on what was happening. And then, once you get your foot in the door, it's so much easier. Like I said, I came back for a second summer because I already had relationships. And so once you kind of kick that door down, that things start happening a lot easier as long as, you come in and do the work and are efficient and helpful. But I think that first one is often very difficult. And so I think using your network as much as you can is helpful. Like, for example, myself, I work at Pfizer now. You can reach out and say, hey, when you guys typically, post your internships for the summer, and I would be able to tell you. So it's also that, people like myself are always willing to help students. And we always say that, but then we don't hear back from students. So I would just encourage you to kind of follow up, put yourself out there. If people are saying that they want to help you, we're happy to do it. So putting yourself out there and just asking because people are willing to help, especially people that we feel are in similar situations. Like I was in your shoes, several years ago, and I was kind of leading myself blindly into industry because, as you mentioned, at the time UNC didn't really do a lot of industry. And so there were a couple of us who kind of had this little group where we talk about, what internships are you applying for and things like that. And I think it's a little bit more organized now, hopefully. But yeah, those are some of the things that I would say are easy to do.
Yeah, that's actually really cute. We definitely do, like, our class will definitely also talk to each other about those spaces. So that's really cute that stayed the same. But yeah, I think there is like a little bit more, but that is super helpful because yeah, you're right. Like, I don't think we empower ourselves enough again just to actually follow through. So it's just reassuring to hear again from someone in the space. So thank you.
No, yeah, definitely. And one thing I've always, been curious about, and I don't know how much value this is when you're looking at internships, but when you're on LinkedIn or you're on the websites looking at the top 50 companies, you're looking for internships, there's going to be a lot of students applying for these internships, whether they're PharmD candidates, MD candidates, PhD students. I don't think it's necessarily for some of them, specific to a professional degree. So I've noticed some students reach out to like recruiters. I don't know how useful that is or how to even navigate that portion. If you've had an experience with that or know any people that have, and if you had any insights on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful. Sometimes it's hard to find out who the
Yeah.
recruiters are. But it can't hurt, honestly. They're on LinkedIn for a reason because they want people to be able to find them. And so I think it's completely reasonable to reach out to people. I have a lot of people who reach out to me on LinkedIn just saying, hey, I saw this job posting. We're connected via this person. Can you chat for 5 minutes? I mean, I think I did that twice last week with 2 people applying for roles. And so I think that LinkedIn's a great platform to be able to not only connect, but also, be able to chat with with other people you might be connected to in a second or third, person fashion. But I think that's really helpful. But like you mentioned, I think it's totally reasonable to reach out to recruiters. I didn't do that a ton when I was doing applications because LinkedIn wasn't as, I would say, prolific at that time. But and they didn't always post who the recruiters were. It was a little bit more difficult to find people. But a lot of the times, internally, we'll kind of circulate CVs and things like that, and kind of do referrals internally as well to other jobs. So I think it's always helpful to reach out and have somebody to talk to and get their perspective to see if it's actually a company you even want to work for, right? It's a two-way street. You even if you get a position, you still want to be, want to work there. So yeah, I think it's great to reach out when you can, and I totally encourage it.
No, definitely. No, that's very helpful because that's something I'd always been confused about is how in depth or how detailed do I have to be with my internship application, because it's not necessarily a written rule that go reach out to recruiters,
Yeah.
And I don't know how much that helps, and obviously it does if it's circulating your CV and resume to some degree, and it's great for networking, but I never really knew just kind of how to start that process, so I thank you for that.
Yeah. And like I said, I think it kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier. Try to find out as much as you can about maybe the product or the area. So for example, if the internship says it has like a oncology focus, go to that company's website, figure out what the top 3 oncology products are and say, hey, I really had an interest in learning about this at school. I see that your company is really involved in this. And I'm looking forward to this new data that you guys say you're going to present at the end of the year. So if you make those like tiny connections, it really helps stand out, your application stand out compared to somebody else. And that process takes 10 minutes to Google and then change one Word document. Like, it's not rocket science. So I always, some people don't ever look at the cover letters and things like that. I do, because I think that the people who want it, they spend the time to take that extra 15 minutes to modify a templated cover letter to make it a little bit more interesting. So those are always kinds of things that I do when I'm writing a cover letter or CV or something like that. But yeah, I think there's always, you can always take one little further step to set you apart from the rest of the crowd.
Exactly. No, I definitely do appreciate that. I think, now that it's become more and more competitive and more people are transitioning to the industry because of, for one, clinical burnout, and to be honest, higher, I guess, more area for you to go upward with your career industry.
Yeah.
That's more appealing to a lot of, newer students, and any possible way to kind of put yourself ahead or you make yourself different than others is helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, and I guess I kind of had a question just in terms of looking at like those pipelines for those companies. Like when you're looking at the company pipeline, kind of balancing, like I guess it's sort of a twofold question. So one, how did you decide like that therapeutic area, like oncology is a therapeutic area? And then how did you balance, like whenever deciding which company to work for, how much did you weigh that? Like what were the factors you considered, I guess, when choosing like which company, and how big a part did oncology play a role in that?
Yeah, so honestly, it's a little bit of trial and error. So when I got my internship with Pfizer, it was originally in this group called GEP, which was Global Established Products. So it was essentially all their products that have gone off patent. So it was like Lipitor, Ticastin, a lot of these older Pfizer drugs that we still had, but they were off patent. So I was originally in that group. And while I was at Pfizer, I kind of got an understanding of how their organization is laid out. So they had this global established product group that actually no longer exists at Pfizer. But really, I was able to understand how the groups were siloed within Pfizer. So we had like a primary care division, we had a vaccines division, we had an oncology division. And so typically the roles in those groups kind of are mirrored in each silo. So there's medical affairs in oncology, there's medical affairs in vaccines, in primary care. And so that's typically how the job descriptions are then presented, right? You're going to be applying for a role in oncology or vaccines or primary care. So that was really helpful to get in to then figure out like how is each organization structured? And then I was able to do that for other organizations too. Because once you start looking at job descriptions, you're like, oh, usually oncology is its own separate division within the company because it's so specialized. Same thing with vaccines typically because it's so specialized. Um, and so when I was at Pfizer, I kind of got a lay of like where was all the exciting, fun things happening. And at that time, it was in breast cancer at Pfizer. And so when I was going to do my fellowship the following year, I actually created a fellowship, but it was in global established products because that's where my manager was at the time. He actually left before I was a fellow. And so when I was going through my fellowship interviews, I actually thought, my boss is now gone in GEP. Do I want to actually go there or do I want to try something else? And so I actually ended up going to the oncology fellowship at Pfizer. And that's how I ended up in oncology. And I've been in that space ever since. And so it really just depends. Like some people have a passion for vaccines. And I think that is so interesting, especially as a pharmacist. So I don't, maybe one day I'll work in vaccines, but it's really just about like figuring out, maybe the first place you go isn't the place you love or end up at. But you have your foot in the door. And sometimes that's the most important part because I found that especially at Pfizer, people stay there for a very long time. We have meetings where we'll do this fun activity where people are like, okay, stand up if you've been here for 5 years, 10 years. We've gone up to like 35 years before. It's crazy.
Wow.
So once you get your foot in the door, it's a lot easier to move around. So I would suggest, even if it's not your favorite disease state, but you are interested in being in medical affairs or working at BMS, like it might be okay for you to try it out and, go from there. So I think that's to answer your first question, kind of about how do you figure out what disease state you like. I think it's a little bit of trial and error, to be honest. And then your second question, remind me.
So it's, I guess, how whenever you're choosing a company, how big of a
Yes.
factor did that play a role for you?
Yeah. So I think it's a little bit hard if you're trying to do a fellowship, to be honest, because it's such a competitive process that you might not like this answer, but if you get a fellowship, great. Like, maybe it's not your top company, but it gets your foot in the door. And sometimes that's the most important part. But I think as I've moved along in my career, I've had a lot more opportunity to do a pro and cons of like, do I actually want to work here or how do I feel about this company? And that's where I think the network comes into play a lot. So after I was a fellow at Pfizer, I actually left because I was moving to Seattle. And unfortunately, Pfizer wanted me to stay in New York, but it wasn't going to happen just because of life. So I actually worked at a next generation sequencing diagnostic company for 6 years that was private and went public while I was there. So I got to see like the very startup of a company all the way to IPO, which was very cool and exciting. But it was a very hard company, like very fast paced. Like I was doing a lot for, just being very early on in my career, but I learned a ton. And then, I had a kid and I decided maybe this isn't the lifestyle I want anymore. So I started to look around at other companies. Ultimately, I did end up back at Pfizer. But I talked to a lot of my other, pharmacy school friends about what companies they were working at. Did they like them? What's the work-life balance like? Because that was super important to me now, as opposed to the last job I was at. So I think as you get along, especially if you have been in industry, there's a lot of room to move around within industry and you can become a lot more selective. But I think mostly through word of mouth is how I've kind of figured out like what's the vibe of the company. And people are, especially through, we talked about LinkedIn a lot. I've gotten so many like connections through LinkedIn where I've just called somebody and had a chat about, hey, do you really like working here? What it's like? What's it like? What's the coolest like benefit that you get that I would have no idea about? So just fun stuff like that. But
Yeah.
yeah.
That's super helpful because I feel like that I've never heard, like that's great advice. Yeah. That's like something in terms of how to navigate that. But thank you for sharing.
Okay, I had kind of a follow-up question, especially kind of when you pick a company, right? Or a pharmaceutical company that you want to, spend your time there. Do you ever ask, other professionals or classmates, former classmates, like, how long do, certain individuals stay at a company? Because I know that's common where, certain professionals are there only for a couple of years and then they have to move elsewhere to a new, and maybe that has to do with how small the company is and how stable they are. but I didn't know how common that was even at bigger companies such as like Pfizer,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
whether that had to dictate, sorry, if that
Oh,
had to
no, no, no.
dictate for like what disease state, such as like oncology, which is a
Mhm.
big, disease state where there's a lot of growth.
Yeah, yeah. I would say it definitely depends on the company. So it there's a little bit of a dichotomy, right? So when I was at a smaller company and I was there, I was kind of I think I was like the third medical hire. I actually it was great because there was nobody to do anything, and so I got to do everything, right? And I moved up quite quickly because frankly, I was one of the person who or person who knew what was going on. And so at a very small company, it's almost good because you can really move up quickly or take on a lot of responsibility. I think where things get difficult is at like the medium-sized companies because they've started to have a little bit more structure and there's a little bit more bureaucracy. So it might be hard to move up within maybe more of like a medium-sized company where there's already established roles and teams and things like that. At Pfizer, I would say that there's a lot of room to move around within like different divisions. They're really big about like they call them zigzag moves, where maybe I stay at the same level, like director level, but maybe I go work in like healthcare policy or I go work in drug safety, or they're really good about like moving people around to get new experiences. But I would still say that as a pretty big company, it's sometimes hard to move up in roles just because it's a lot more established. But I'm so new again at Pfizer that I'm not in the space right now to be like, oh, I should be getting a promotion or whatnot. So, maybe ask me again in a couple of years. um, but I think it really just depends on the company and the culture. I feel like everybody, like I mentioned at Pfizer, like people stay there forever, which I think is great. And it just shows like people are willing to try new things and move people around, which is really exciting. And I have a lot of other passions. And like I said, Talia, we were talking about health policy. And so that might be something I want to do in the future. But yeah, I'm enjoying it thus far. But yeah, I could see how depending on the size of the company, it could make a difference for sure.
No,
Yeah.
definitely. That's really cool. I mean, that'd been always one of my worries is job security, right? Just generally,
Mhm.
like, where does that sit in a pharmaceutical company, especially like when drugs go on patent, like get off patent, like where do you sit
Yeah.
an individual such as like an MSL, like you're advocating to
Mhm.
professionals about a certain product and now you're
Yeah.
no longer there?
It it's scary sometimes. Like I took a little bit of a risk when I went to this small startup and it worked out great for me. And I think early on in my career was the right time to do it. Like I had a lot of, I was young and I could work a lot. I didn't have a family. And so I was really scared to leave Pfizer because I was going from this super stable role to a startup that like had just gotten some funding, but you never know what's going to happen, right? And so it was really fun for me to do that. And I learned a ton. And, not every startup works out. So it
Mhm.
works out well, but I got kind of lucky, and not just what is happening sometimes. But yeah, it is a little scary to go to a smaller company or even a medium-sized company, especially ones where every trial is like our company is going to live or die based on this data.
Mhm.
So it depends on your risk tolerance. I would say when I was younger, I was a lot more riskier and it worked out. But the opposite could also happen. So you have to be prepared for that. But I think for me, it was a good experience, whether it worked or not. I learned a ton and was able to, develop basically our whole medical affairs organization from scratch, which was, when I was 24 or whatever, like that was a great experience. So there's always some pros and cons you have to think about.
Yeah,
No,
I guess. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
no, sorry, go ahead, Talia.
I guess I was kind of wondering if you could expand more on that process of how did you find the startup company? Because I
Mhm.
like there's platforms like NC Biotech, like there's different places
Mhm.
that I've been kind of looking at, and it's hard to
Yeah.
whenever you're looking at those companies, how to evaluate like I guess what factors did you look at when deciding this company versus other
Yeah.
companies?
So when I was moving to Seattle, and I knew I had to leave Pfizer, I started to look at all of the first pharma companies in Seattle. So there was like Seattle Genetics, Juno, BMS bought Juno eventually, but there's a couple small like biotechs here. And all of the roles that were posted were all mostly in like publications and scientific communications, which is not something I was super interested in. I'm like reading pubs all day. It was just not my thing. I wanted more of like a headquarter-based medical affairs role where it's more strategy and like field medical strategy and headquarter-based strategy. And so I really couldn't find any of those jobs, to be honest. And
Yeah.
so I started to contact some of my friends who were from Seattle. My husband is from here, so he knows a lot of people. And I talked to like the dean of the UW Pharmacy School, and she was giving me some information about some of the local businesses. I would talk to friends' parents about, have you heard anything about biotech in Seattle? And randomly, I got connected through my friend's dad to this company in Seattle that had just gotten some funding. They were really small, but they had just hired their first kind of commercialization lead for a product they were working on. And he had just hired the first medical person. And so that person was now hiring their team, and the timing just kind of worked out. So honestly, I think if you're in the mood for startup life,
Yeah.
honestly, the best way to go about it is through like networking and because a lot of the roles people don't post online at that point. They don't even have a website sometimes, or a job, a careers page on their website yet. But there's also been times where if I've been looking for roles in Seattle, I'll go to like a startup's website and they'll just have like a general like email. Sometimes I'll just email that email with my CV and say, hey, I'm not sure like where you guys are, but if you're ever interested in chatting, that's always a way to do it as well. But yeah, it was a fun experience. Learned a lot, but yeah, it's for a certain type of person for sure.
Yeah.
Like you have to be ready to go and be okay with like a lot of change and fast paced environment. But it was a lot of fun. I learned a lot.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's an amazing experience, I imagine. And I guess how did you kind of leverage that experience into your next role? And can you expand a little bit more on your current role?
Yeah. So um, when COVID happened, I was working from home like everyone else. I had just had a kid, and I was kind of reevaluating where I was. I'd been at my current company for 6 years. We had gone through an IPO. It was a lot of fun, learned a lot, but I was kind of at the point where like I really wanted to get back into the pharmaceutical space because I'd been in diagnostics for 6 years. And I was really kind of missing that passion for like drugs and talking about drugs versus diagnostics, which I know way too much about now. And so it was around that time when I was kind of reevaluating myself, trying to think, is the startup life still really for me? Very busy and hectic. And I really thought, maybe now's the time to kind of go back to industry, go back to the pharma world. And so I actually got an email through the Rutgers listserv that we have, where people send job postings. So anybody that goes through the Rutgers Fellowship Program, we're on this big listserv, and you can post jobs and things like that, and we get emails about it. So I got this random email about an opening at Pfizer in their content and education department. And while I was a fellow, they had just started that team, so I didn't really know a lot about it actually. But I applied, and that's kind of how I got back into the fold at Pfizer. But essentially, what I'm in charge of is I oversee all of our lung, colorectal, and melanoma products. So we have 5. And I do all of the content development and internal medical training for those products. And so what that means is I'll kind of break it down into 2 pieces. We'll start with content development. So I develop all of our medical content for our field medical teams. So any like slide decks that they present, infographics. We also develop things like videos and podcasts that we put on our Pfizer medical website. I'll help draft like tweets and LinkedIn posts. So anything related to like taking our content and taking it from like a publication or poster and oral, and then creating new, educational content based on that original content. So how do we take our really intense scientific publications and make them into something that somebody can understand, like a 30-second video? So it's really fun because it's kind of a hybrid of creative work and scientific knowledge. And we really try to create content that is bite-sized, easy to understand, really visually appealing, and trying to weed out the most important information, so that we're not giving you like 100 slides to look at, but there's 15 or 20 that are very impactful. So that's my job, is to develop all of that content for the 5 assets that I oversee. So that's kind of part one, is the content. And then part two is training. And so I'm in charge of organizing all of our internal medical training events and programs for my 5 assets. So essentially, anytime we have a new data set come out at a conference or a new publication, or hey, we want to bring in this KOL to come and talk to our team to train and educate them, I organize all of those training programs and kind of execute those internally. So it's nice because it's just a medical to medical audience. It's really high scientific discussion. And so that's kind of the second piece, is the internal training, which is also a lot of fun. It allows me to engage with a lot of like our field medical teams and things like that. So it's a lot of fun. But essentially, I work really closely with our medical directors who kind of set the strategy. And then I take their strategy and try to turn it into content that we can use out in the public.
Wow, yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's cool. That like I've never heard of that specific. Like I haven't heard as much about it, so it's so cool to.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies are now starting to understand the appeal of this department. Like I said, when I originally left Pfizer, we had just hired like the first person for this team. And then we expanded it to all of oncology. So we're now like 15 people in oncology that do this role. And they've also now expanded this role across all of Pfizer. So now we have a content and education team in vaccines. We have a content and education teams in, all of our other divisions. So I feel like it's becoming more and more of a thing, because in the past, what's happened is like the medical directors have developed slide decks, or the field medical teams have developed slide decks, but that really pulls them away from thinking strategically or talking to a clinician in the field, which is what they should be doing, not sitting in front of their computer and developing slide decks, right? So we basically carved out that role at Pfizer into its own role so that we can really be like the creative minds. And to be honest, our content turns out a lot better than like a medical director creating something in PowerPoint, because I'm very good at PowerPoint and developing like animations and things like that, that I've learned over time. So they're really easy to understand. We use a lot of like colors and visuals, and try to use icons and text to supplement the data instead of just having like bullets and bullets on a slide. We really try to like think about it creatively so that the message comes across, but in a way that is easier to understand when you're just looking at a slide.
Yeah. It's impressive the amount of building you've been able to do in your career, though. Like it just sounds like you've really like been like the start of a lot of different aspects. So that's just so cool to hear what that's like to be on that side of it. That's just my takeaway. Yeah. That's cool.
I had a follow-up question on that, because I think that's really cool, especially with more of the outreach and being able to take a lot of dense information and kind of, lighten it up so that people can read it and understand it. And this question may be more of the audience of like people like us in the inside industry, where we're trying to build a platform for students and pre-pharmacy students where they can come to us and learn more about industries or careers. So I didn't know if you had any advice for us specifically in how we could improve, or if there's any things you look for when you're looking on a specific platform that may be more appealing that most
I
don't know.
mean, what's so interesting that I think now is, originally when I was going through the fellowship process, right, there was like medical affairs, regulatory affairs, med info. And now, especially as medical affairs, I feel like has grown in a lot of companies, because companies have seen the value that medical brings to their organization. Now, even within medical affairs, there's even more roles that are being created, like this whole content education role, right? Technically, I sit under medical affairs, but I'm not like the lead medical director, right? I'm kind of like an additional group that works with the medical directors, kind of like how we have a publications team and we have a medical information team. Now we have a content and education team. And so I think, one of the places that I went to kind of learn about everything when I was a fellow was the Rutgers website. I know I keep talking about Rutgers because I did my fellowship through them, and they were kind of the biggest program at the time. And now a lot of other schools have amazing and big fellowship programs that I think are just equally as great. But I went to the Rutgers website, and they had nice handouts that kind of explained what each fellowship was. And that was really helpful, especially as I was going through the interview process to figure out like, okay, medical affairs. Medical affairs doesn't always mean the same thing at each company, right? Sometimes medical information at Pfizer does the same thing that medical affairs at BMS does. Like,
Right.
for example, like review committee and reviewing promotional materials. Sometimes that sits in medical information, and sometimes that sits in the broader medical affairs, like directors, or, the medical directors at certain companies. So you really have to read the fine print to understand like what does medical affairs mean at this company, because it depends on how they have separated out their organization, and each company does it differently, which causes a lot of confusion.
Yeah.
And so that's where I went, honestly, to figure out like, okay, BMS, I'm applying for their cardiovascular fellowship. This is exactly what the tasks are. And that might be different than another medical affairs role. So if there's any way to kind of like create a summary of like, all these different like subgroups, like this is a new one you probably have never heard of, content and education, but it's becoming a bigger thing at not only Pfizer, but other groups are now establishing it. So I think that was one thing that was like super confusing to me at first. And one thing that was nice they also had was like 2-minute videos on like, what does regulatory affairs mean? What does, state drug safety mean? I thought those were really helpful too when I was younger. And also like just listening to industry talks and things like that. And like Pfizer actually internally has a group called Pharmacists at Pfizer. And we do industry talks with students. I can send you guys the link to the next one.
Yeah.
But I was like all in on like, I'm going to listen to as much as I can because I literally have no idea what I'm doing. And you just kind of learn it as you go along.
No, definitely. I think that's really cool. And, one thing that I'm still struggling with, and you kind of touched on it, is what are all these roles in the industry for pharmacists, and how are they related? How do they,
Mhm.
work together? How do they keep each other in check? Kind of what that relationship is. And
Yeah.
I've been trying to figure out that whole like picture, and it's become more and more of a web. Like you said, med
Hmm.
affairs is so broad. There's so many sub careers, subspecialties that, I've never heard of.
Yeah.
And every time I feel like I've got some kind of an understanding, something new. For example, your profession, I had no
Yeah.
idea till
Yeah.
now. So I think
Yeah.
finding a way to like kind of put that puzzle together would be a really cool way to get more people involved.
Yeah. And I think that's why I'm glad I went into like a general medical affairs fellowship instead of like going into med info or publications or something. Because I feel like if you started medical affairs, you kind of get to work with everybody and it gives you a good flavor of like what's going on. And then if you want to specialize in like med info, that's great. Pubs, that's great. Um, and that was kind of a good basis for me to understand like all the moving pieces because it is quite a lot and it's confusing. And like you said, sometimes you're just like it's the blind leading the blind because there's not a lot of resources for students who want to get into industry. So yeah, it's crazy, but I would just say like just keep at it. Reach out to people that people are willing to help. So you just kind of gotta keep on it if you're interested. And I promise it's worth it at the end because my work-life balance is great, my pay is great. I'm not a morning person, so the idea of me getting up for rounds in the morning was just not happening.
Yeah.
So I'm really happy I kept at it and it worked out in the end.
I'm happy for you too, because yeah, the more yeah, that's so relatable. Um, for I guess I had a question about what your role kind of going off what you were saying, who your role interacts with on like a
Mhm.
day-to-day basis and how
Yeah,
they're like what's that
yeah.
relationship like, I guess.
Yeah, so mostly I'm working with our medical directors and our field medical team. So we
Right.
have global medical directors who kind of set the global strategy. And then we also have US medical directors who lead the US strategy. So when I'm creating content, typically I create two versions of everything, one for our global team and then one for our US team. And the reason why is because US has more strict guidance typically on how we can present data, for example. But I work with those two groups of medical directors very closely. I was right before this, I was on a call with four of them. We were talking about therapy management content. So those groups of people all the time. And then secondly is I would say our field medical team. So I sit on a couple committees with our field medical teams. So we have one for lung, one for CRC, and one for melanoma. And essentially once or twice a month, we meet together as a group and we talk about what's coming up in the next month, what new data are we going to have, what resources are being developed, what training is going to happen, just to be on the same page of like what's going on and what do we need to be prepared for. So I also meet and they give us feedback on the content. So, hey, this link is actually broken, or, this p-value was wrong. Hopefully that doesn't happen too often. But if there's any like things they want to change about the flow of the story that we're trying to convey, I'll take their feedback and then incorporate that into future versions of content. So it's really helpful to get their feedback and insight that they're here because they're the ultimate user, right, of a lot of the material we're developing. So I work really closely with them. And then I also work with people like our medical information team to see what common questions they're getting, because maybe that's a gap in terms of education and we can create some content to fill that gap. I work with our pubs team to figure out, hey, what's the latest data that's coming out so that I can make sure that we're developing content so that it's ready when the new data is available. So yeah, I work with mostly the medical team specifically, but I also work with like our clinical development team because they're running our ongoing trials. So for example, we're trying to get a new approval this year in lung cancer. So I'm working with them to understand where are we in terms of the FDA approval, So that's kind of the clinical development side. I also work with our commercial team in more of a limited capacity, I would say, but just to understand like what are they doing? What insights are they hearing? I give them updates on what medical is doing, just so we're kind of aware of like what each, what the right and the left hand are doing.
Yeah.
But it's more just FYI. It's not like we take any direction from them. But yeah, those are kind of the typical people I would work with. But it's really fun because it's always like interesting to meet new people, and I'm working with so many different groups. And that's honestly one of the reasons I wanted to go into industry, was because every call is something new and different. And I felt like for me, working in a hospital or a community setting was just like, it was too repetitive for me. And I like more of the project-based work and feeling accomplished of like, hey, I finished this really cool new, video with the KOL on this new data that just came out at ASCO. And I got to like go to New York and record the video at our studio and do all of the editing with our
That's so
agency.
cool.
So it's just like, it's much more creative and fun. And so, yeah, I'm really happy where I'm at. And I like the creative aspect of it, but also tying in the medical aspect of it.
Yeah. Wow. That's a really cool opportunity to meld those. Yeah.
Yeah.
I kind of have a more like broader, I guess, it could be a chewable question, however you see it, but you kind of alluded to it with a couple of your answers, but why Pfizer? What is something that most students, professionals don't know about Pfizer that really is appealing, right?
Yeah. So, Pfizer's been getting a lot of great press because of all the COVID stuff. And, when I joined Pfizer, people would ask where I worked, I'd be like, oh, I work at Pfizer. And people would be like, thank you. And I'm like, I don't do anything related to COVID. I literally don't do any COVID stuff. But, I don't know, this sounds like such a cop out, but all the work we do is really for the patient. And I feel like as a group and an organization, like that really is at the core of what we're trying to do. And we talk about it all the time. Like, how is this going to impact patients? How are we using our money in the way that will make the best outcomes for patients? And so at the end of the day, it really feels like I'm doing something good and I'm helping. And especially working in the oncology space, I think everybody has some type of relationship to cancer. And anything that I can do really makes me feel like the work I'm doing is good. And I also really enjoy it. And I really love working here. Like I came back to Pfizer. So obviously it's somewhere I wouldn't come back if I didn't enjoy it the first time. But I personally enjoy like how organized it is, how open people are to helping. Pfizer is really good about like uh, showing like encouragement for the work you do that might not be your work. So we have these things called Bravo points where you can like thank people by giving them points and then you can redeem it for cool stuff. Like I just bought an inflatable kayak because like I got all these Bravo points from people. So people are just like really nice. And like it's such a breath of fresh air to just work with like people who want to help and are nice and are willing to help you. And I don't know if that's just my team at Pfizer, but it's been great. I've been here for a little over a year now. And I really love it and enjoy it. So Yeah, that's my short answer, or maybe long answer.
No, definitely. That's something I always look into. Like, for example, when I was applying to pharmacy school, so one thing I always did was like look at the environment, like what,
Mhm.
to speak freely, what's the vibe? Like, I'm gonna go
Mhm.
ask the students and, give me your honest answer. Like, what do you think? Like,
Yeah.
what are you guys as a cohort? Like, are you guys very helpful? Are you guys very like laid back? Are you guys so competitive where actually everyone feels so, lonely? So that's really
Mhm.
awesome that you kind of have that relationship, a very open, breath of fresh air relationship with your coworkers where you can get an inflatable kayak. So I think that's really cool. Uh,
Yeah.
that's something that should be valued when, applying for internships or companies, like you said.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, it looks like we're coming up on time, so just want to be mindful of that. So if you want to go ahead and wrap, Rovi.
Yes, of course. So first of all, I want to thank you, Dr. Demaree, for taking the time to join us on this podcast. We certainly value everything you've said. It'll definitely help us in our journey through the industry, and I'm sure our viewers, whether they're pre-pharmacy, pharmacy students, even MDs, PhD students, I'm sure they'll all appreciate it. As we know, the industry is very, very big, and there's a lot of career specialties, and you've certainly had a lot of experiences that are valuable. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so
No,
much.
you guys, I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
Hope you guys enjoyed this video and make sure to hit that subscribe button. Also, stay tuned for a new consulting business that will be catered to our pre-pharm and pharmacy students interested in getting into the industry with an internship. Again, thank you guys for watching and please hit that subscribe button.